Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the GSMC Hockey Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Garrison McDaniel, and we have a great show for you guys today. We're going to be diving right into the action, talking about the Edmonton Oilers, of course, this entire week dedicated to the Stanley Cup Finals. That will be starting on Saturday. So, to continue that theme, we're going to be starting our first segment talking about the Oilers, their history in the Stanley Cup Finals, how many times they've been there, and how many times that they have won. The Panthers not having too much of a history. I didn't dive too deep into it, but we will talk about it a little bit in that segment as well. Our second segment will be me talking about the regular season matchup between these two teams, who it favored, and who really stood out in all those matchups. Third segment will be me discussing the legend of Joe Pavelski, who has announced his retirement. One of the oldest players in the league is now hanging up the skates. It's always sad whenever somebody retires, but we always take a look back on the careers of the legends that do retire, and he definitely fits that bill. And stick around in the show for our fourth segment, talking about the furthest Stanley Cup Finals in history between two teams, how that can affect the teams, and what kind of storylines we can grab from that. And then in the fifth and final segment of the night, we'll wrap things up by talking about the special teams units for each team and how could be a very big key for the Stanley Cup Finals. But as always, before we get into any of that, guys, I would love to remind you that if you want to become a part of the show, be of bigger support than you guys already are, of course, use the GSMCpodcast.net tips and donations link. If you want to ask me any questions, it'll show up across the screen as well if you use that link. So, if you guys want to support the show more than you guys already do, that is the best way to do it. But without further ado, we're going to get right into our first segment of the night, talking about Edmonton's history in the Stanley Cup Finals, a little bit of a deep dive into that. The Edmonton Oilers have a rich history. They've been a team for a very long time and have had, the best player of all time. They've also had a few of the Hall of Fame legends of the sport on their team at the same time as well. So they had a dynasty in the 80s. Of course they had a dynasty in the 80s, and that's what we're talking about here. In the 80s, you have Wayne Gretzky, you have Jari Kurri, you have Mark Messier. Of course, all of these players go so far into helping you win a Stanley Cup, and all of them did. They became a dynasty during the Gretzky years. He was, of course, on fire, scoring at will, assisting at will. He leads the entire NHL in points all time by a significant margin. All of his stats are ridiculous. It's because, one, his team, and two, because he was absolutely ridiculous as a player. But going into their kind of runs in the 80s and in their dynasty years, 83, they went to so these were the years that they went to the Cup Final. 1984, 1985, 1987, 1988, 1990, 2006, and of course this year in 2024 will make it 8th time. In those appearances, this is how they shaped up. In their first ever appearance I almost said 1883 again. In 1983, they were swept by the New York Islanders, as the New York Islanders were the other team kind of going off at this time, of course, with their four-peat. This was the final of the New York Islanders four-peat. And then in 1984, they beat the New York Islanders in 5. In 1985, they won their second cup, beating the Broad Street Bully Flyers in 5. In 1987, they beat the Flyers again, this time in 7. That was a grueling series for them, but a very impressive one nonetheless. In 1988, they swept the Boston Bruins. In 1990, they beat the Bruins again in 5. The theme with the Oilers and their early years and their cup years, they love to play the same team. Islanders, Flyers, Bruins. Those were the teams that they faced in those cup runs or in those cup finals. I think that's pretty funny. They faced the Canes in 2006, and then in 2024. Now, of course, they're facing the Panthers. They lost to the Canes in 7 once again. So they played 2 sevens, 2 of them went to 7 games, 3 of them went to 5, and then 2 of them were sweeps. They swept one team, got swept by another team, and lost a series in 7. So they're 5-2 overall in Stanley Cup Finals up to this point, with 5 cups, of course. Very impressive record. 5-2. That means that it's very difficult. I would not be betting on this series to go to 6 at any for either teams. I think the odds on. I think the favorite for the series outlook is Panthers in 7, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a good bet. Or everywhere else besides 6, because the Oilers have not played only 6 games or just 6 games in a cup final in their history, and they have a rich history. So yeah, they won it in 1984, 1985, 1987, 1988, 1990. 1990 was the last Stanley Cup that the Edmonton Oilers won. They won that one without Wayne Gretzky. Of course, everybody knows the infamous D trade that happened in 1988, but that happened in the fall of 1988, and Wayne Gretzky won his 4th and final cup with the Edmonton Oilers in the summer/spring of 1988. So after they won 4 cups, they deal with the best player of all time, and at that point, he was probably the best player of all time. Maybe it was Gordie Howe or Bobby Orr up to that point, but he was absolutely insane. And then they deal him to the LA Kings, and then they win one in 1990. So it proved to be the right decision at the time, winning the cup. Now we look back on it as probably the worst trade in sports history, but that's how trades are in sports. So 1990 was the only time that they've ever won a Stanley Cup without Wayne Gretzky. They still had Mark Messier on their team, They still had Jari Kurri on that team. That dynasty team had so many legends, it's hard to keep track of. But now it's kind of what we're seeing with Connor McDavid, and this is kind of why I want to bring up the history of the Edmonton Oilers. Is very. Connor McDavid has always reminded me of Wayne Gretzky, and in every single aspect of his game, it reminds me of Wayne Gretzky. He is the only player that's ever played in an Edmonton Oilers jersey that does the same things on a hockey or on a hockey ice as Wayne Gretzky could. He's so good. Is he able to cement his name in the history books of the Edmonton Oilers? Wayne Gretzky, of course, is the name that you think about when you're thinking of the Edmonton Oilers. Next is Jari Kurri, because of what he was able to do right next to Wayne Gretzky on his wing. Then you think of Mark Messier, because he captained them to a Stanley Cup in 1990. You more or less think of Mark Messier as a New York Ranger nowadays, but he, of course, won them the Stanley Cup in 1990, helped them win their 4 cups from 84 to 88 before Wayne Gretzky left. So, of course, Wayne Gretzky had his help, and Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, I think they rival that of the Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier. Maybe you could toss on. You wouldn't compare Ryan Nugent-Hopkins at all to Jari Kurri, but if you want for the sake of comparisons, of course you could. Left winger for Connor McDavid gets a lot of points because he's on the wing for him. It was Zach Hyman this year, but of course players have been on Connor McDavid's wing that have produced very well, above what you would expect them to. Maybe Jari Kurri might not fit that mold. Maybe you expect him to be such a great player in his own right because he was such a great player in his own right. So for Connor McDavid, he has that supporting cast now, and I think he needs to win this cup because of he went to the worst franchise that he possibly could have. He has to always have that name Wayne Gretzky attached to him. If he didn't get drafted by the Edmonton Oilers, there's 0% chance that we had these talks. I think we compare him more to. I think I would honestly compare Connor McDavid more to Mario Lemieux in his style of play than I would Wayne Gretzky, but he wears the same jersey as Gretzky, so of course you're talking about those two players in the same mold always. And for Connor McDavid, that's such a heavy weight to hold on your shoulders. I mean, this is the greatest player in hockey history, not even close. So to have that name and that weight on your shoulders, it's hard. It's so hard for Connor McDavid. So to win a Stanley Cup this year in 2024, and his only chance that he's really had to win a Stanley Cup, will go such a long way, and it will be huge for his legacy and his career. He he of course has not done enough to get his jersey retired, but if he continues on the same trajectory, I think he eventually does get his jersey retired for the Oilers organization, even without winning a Stanley Cup. He's already the second highest assist total in Edmonton Oilers history. He's the fourth highest point total in Edmonton Oilers history. I think fourth highest goal total in the Edmonton Oilers history. And these records are shared by Gretzky, Messier, and Curry. So we're putting his name already up there with that big three of the Edmonton Oilers of the past. But without a cup, I can't help but feel like his career could be a waste. He's the most talented hockey player I've ever seen with my own two eyes. By far the most talented hockey player I've ever seen with my own two eyes. And I think when you're playing for an organization like the Edmonton Oilers, such a rich in history organization, they've won the cup 5 times. And they've won it without Gretzky. So it's not even like you can use that excuse, well, only Gretzky can win in Edmonton. They've won it 5 times. They've won it without Gretzky, with Curry and Mark Messier. So for Connor McDavid to be able to add his name to that list of, well, you only have 1 cup without Gretzky, now you have 2. One of it being Messier and Curry, the other one being Draisaitl and McDavid, I think would go huge for his legacy. And right now, the Stanley Cup is the hardest trophy to win in sports by far. It wasn't like that so much in the 80s. In the 80s, you had the Oilers, the Islanders, the Flyers, the Bruins, the Penguins were pretty competitive. The Canadians were having down years in the 80s. You had in the West, it was really the Oilers, the Kings when they got Gretzky, that was pretty much it in the West. And then in the East, you had, of course, the Bosch Bully Flyers. You had the Four Pete Islanders. You had the Bruins, who were really good in this time. You had the Rangers, who have always been very good. So in the 80s, it was a little bit easier to win in the West. Nowadays, you have, and I went through this when I talked about it after the conference finals. Now you have the Oilers, the Avalanche, the Stars, the Canucks, the Jets when we were going into the postseason, the Vegas Golden Knights. 6 out of 8 teams in the Western Conference could have gone to the Stanley Cup from the West. That is so hard to that was a gauntlet. They had to go through the Kings, who was one of 2 teams that I really didn't think that could make it to the Cup final, and the Kings were pretty good in the regular season. The Kings, then they had to play the Vancouver Canucks, who was the second best team in the Western Conference. They were fantastic all the regular season. They were looking like they could have won the President's Trophy at some points in the regular season, and then they beat them in 7. And then you're playing the Dallas Stars, who have already gone to the Cup in the 2020s. In 2020, they went to the Stanley Cup. You are facing them with an even better team than they came in 2020. Jake Ottinger being a huge addition for them. Miro Heiskanen being so much better than he was in 2020. Of course, you have Jamie Benn, Tyler Seguin, these players playing so well. You have Joe Pavelski, who just retired, and we'll talk about how huge of a player that is no matter what team he's played for. So in the West, it was so hard for the Oilers nowadays. So I think 1 cup could definitely rival that 1990 Cup for the Edmonton Oilers. I think that's a very interesting conversation that I would want to get into in the event that the Edmonton Oilers do win this Cup, but I think I'll hold that off for if they do win the Cup. But that'll wrap it up for our first segment, talking about a little bit of the history of the Edmonton Oilers and how they have done in Stanley Cup Finals of the past. When I come back, we'll be talking about the regular season matchup between these 2 teams and what that could say, or what that could spell out for the Stanley Cup Final.